Hey, how's it going? It's been quite some time since I just sat down in front of a computer screen and complained about something that's been bothering me. I haven't done that in probably almost 10 years now, so um, I thought I would do that today and talk a little bit about something that has been bothering me quite a bit over the last couple of years here. Really, honestly, actually, it's been bothering me on some level pretty much my entire life, but it's this thesis, and I wrote about it in a recent essay that every operating system, every piece of software imaginable is just absolutely terrible. It's all bad. It's all bad. And you hear this mindset whenever someone complains about like, "Oh, I just got this new computer. I just have this new laptop. Why doesn't anything work right?" Right? And it seems counterintuitive because every piece of hardware imaginable, hard drives, memory, processors, even screens, have come just so far in such a short amount of time. Like, the people who wrote Unix, like Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson, well, Ken Thompson passed away, unfortunately, but Dennis Ritchie is still alive, right? Brian Kernighan, the guy who wrote, grep and a lot of these old school Unix programs, he's still alive. These people are still around. So they remember the early history of computing and they've seen what it's become now. And it's honestly a disgrace. Like if you ask yourself honestly, if you're disagreeing with me here, if you're not if this concept of everything being terrible is like I guess if it's offensive to you, if me suggesting this is bothersome to you, ask yourself honestly, like whatever computer you run now, right? Let's say you got a Windows 7 machine. Does that, regardless of how good the hardware is, does your machine today honestly run better than whatever machine you had 20 years ago did? Honestly, does a modern Windows 11 PC or Mac OS Sierra or whatever you're running, is it better than whatever you had in 2005? And I would bet that except for some niche applications that are really hardware intensive, like video editing or 3D animation, whatever you're running today is probably worse. It's probably slower. It's probably glitchier. It's probably shittier. And that's true even if you're not running Windows or Mac OS. If you're running Ubuntu, like Linux Mint or something, it's probably also bad. And people have talked about this before, this idea of, the Windowsification of Linux, the Windows kind of thing. And it is happening, unfortunately, regardless of the efforts of a lot of these developers. Linux is heading in the same direction as the proprietary operating systems that we all hate, right? It used to be, back when Windows XP went out of security support in, I think it was like 2014. A lot of people took their old Windows XP machines that couldn't be upgraded to Windows Vista or Windows 7, and they just said, "Oh, I'll just put Linux on it." And if you were putting like a Ubuntu 14.04 on it, you got a massive improvement in performance because of how much cleaner of an operating system Linux was over Windows. That's not really the case anymore. If you write Windows, what is it? Windows 10 is going out of support at the end of the year, and I'll be willing to bet that a lot of people, because we always see this bump in Linux desktop usage every time a Windows version goes out of support. When that happens in a month, a ton of people are going to install Ubuntu or Mint or Fedora or some kind of like very user-friendly distribution, and they're going to be disappointed in a way that they probably weren't 20 years ago because those operating systems are just as bloated. I mean, not just as bloated, but they're getting there to what Windows is today. And people, it begs the question of why, right? So that's really what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to break down this more or less unstructured rant. I do have a little bit of a script here. I want to talk about why modern operating systems suck. I want to talk about the competing interests in the open source world as part of the reason of why this is happening. I want to critique the components of a modern Linux distribution. I want to talk about better alternatives, and then I'll give you a little bit of a conclusion. So why is this happening? Why do operating systems suck? Why is this happening? Um, there is a term for what I'm going to talk about. It's called the hardware software problem, or basically it's the idea that even as hardware has gotten better, and it has, right? I mean, you think about, right, 20 years ago, your whatever machine you ran probably had, it probably had maybe 256 or 512 megabytes of RAM. And today you've got maybe 8 or 16, maybe more, right? You might have some ridiculous loadout here. You've probably got, you've gone from 32 gig of storage to probably upwards of a terabyte, maybe less if you're running a Mac machine. Your CPU is probably 50 to 100 times faster, maybe even more, right? You've got screen resolutions that are way better, windowing environments that are way more complex and able to perform more complicated tasks. And yet, your system runs worse. They call this Wirth's Law. This is what I was looking for. Wirth's Law is an adage on computer performance which states that software gets slower more rapidly than hardware gets faster. And this is true, right? As we design more and more impressive resources for our software to run on, those applications, the people who develop them get lazier and lazier, and the value of, preserving system resources, of being conservative with system resources, that mentality goes out the window. So I saw somewhere that the average Chrome tab now takes up like 650 megabytes of memory. That's insane. That is completely insane. And it also fits just anecdotally with people who are, they're like, oh, I can't have Steam and more than 3 Chrome tabs open on my PC with like an Intel i9 and 64 gigs of RAM. And I have some pretty modern systems here, and I can't run a game and have a Chrome tab open. Not that I use Chrome. Chrome is for real goobers, but not that I even could, right? Sometimes people call this the Andy and Bill paradigm, after Intel CEO Andy Grove and Microsoft CEO Bill Gates, right? Whatever Andy giveth, Bill taketh away, right? But a lot of modern programs, not just operating systems, but any modern program, they're really, really wasteful. They're bloated. They don't have the, like I said, that mindset of, hey, we have to preserve resources. We have to be as unresource intensive as possible. Developers just don't focus on that anymore. And as a result, everything is just kind of terrible. Part of that has to do, too, with this idea of feature creep, right? These developers, they build out features in their programs that are really, really niche, really, really not terribly commonly used, and as a result, these programs just get bigger and bigger and more monstrous. And also anti-user technology, right? These closed source programs, the people who develop them, they don't want people to be able to customize or manipulate their programs except in the narrow ways that you're supposed to. So they lock down these applications, and by locking down the applications, they make them more and more larger and larger, right? So what can we do to fix this, right? Because this is a good question. Part of fixing it has to understand how we got here and why Linux is in the same position as like Microsoft or Apple are. And what that has to do, I'm going to use an old school, I'm not even going to use computing technology, I'm going to use a legal pad to demonstrate this. Basically, in the open source movement, free and open source movement, and also just software development in general, there's basically 3 competing interests, and this is part of the reason why these things happen, why sometimes there's disagreements between different parts of the community. So the first place where the first worldview, the first mindset of these 3, which you can think of as like the 3 estates of the clergy, the nobility, and the peasantry, if that makes sense. The first, which is sort of the clergy in my analogy, are people who are really, really concerned with the unix philosophy. For those of you who don't know what that is, the The Unix philosophy is this idea that software should be small and modular. And this is really what made Unix so beautiful in the time when it first came out. Unix programs, especially in their infancy, were all built to be, hey, we have this need for a very, very specific program. Let's make a specific program for that need and allow people to pipe things between them so that they can build out more specific niche applications. The classic example, and there's a video online, I think it's just called The Unix Philosophy. It's from Bell Labs back in the 70s or 80s. And Brian Kernighan talked about an example of this. So let's say I want to take a file, right? I want to check the words in that file against a dictionary, which is in a different file, right? I want to number the lines, I want to remove duplicates, check them, and then output that content to another file. So here's how I would do it, sort of. This is pseudocode, but so let's say my file is file.txt, right? So what my program would look like, what my command would look like, so I'm going to cat file.txt. I'm going to print the contents of that file, concatenate them, cat. I'm going to pipe that into a program called line. So I'm going to take every word and put it on its own line. Then I'm going to pipe that to a program called remove duplicates, right? I'm going to pipe that into a program called diff, and I'm going to check that against dictionary.txt, and I'm going to pipe that to output that to a file called errors. So instead of having one program that's just say, hey, check this file against the dictionary, I've used really 5 programs, right? Cat, line, remove, diff, and then output. Why is that important? Why not just make one program that does this? Because if we were to make one program that does this, it would take up more space, right? And we wouldn't necessarily have all of these smaller programs. Now the user, if the user wants to build these into a script so that he can easily check for errors, he can do that. But by keeping that big program not standard, by just shipping these smaller utilities, you give the user more freedom to do what they want. You keep the system clean. It makes development easier because instead of having to manage one enormous file, because imagine if you packaged this into one big program, right? Then every time you updated, you changed, or you had developed something with the diff program, you'd have to go back and fix this whole thing, right? But by having it just be these 4, you don't have to worry about it. So this is the Unix philosophy, and this is one movement, right? The idea of keeping things simple. Most people don't like that because keeping things simple also makes things difficult. The second participant in this conflict are the hardcore free software people, the Richard Stallmans, the Free Software Foundation. They want to keep everything free and open source, as pure as possible, right? And they don't necessarily care as much about the modularity of things like Unix, of the Unix philosophy. And you see this this conflict sometimes in some of the programs that are out there that are free and open source, but that are absolutely terrible. They violate the Unix philosophy horrifically. GNOME is perhaps the worst offender of this. But if it's more important to you to keep things free than it is to keep things modular, then you are going to prefer non-modular free programs over modular proprietary programs. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, right? I'm in the free software movement. I like free software. But that conflict can create problems down the line. And we'll talk a bit more about that. The last component of this triad are people who just want to make things user-friendly. They don't care as much about modularity. They don't care as much about making things entirely free. They just want to make something that's mostly free, that's good enough, that works for the user, right? And by works for the user, a lot of times what that means is dealing with things, making things able to handle programs that are not free, that do not respect users' rights. The classic example of this is Canonical, right? Canonical, which publishes Ubuntu, for those of you who don't know, they care very much about making Ubuntu user-friendly, right? And it's stupidly user-friendly. You cannot make an easier-to-use distribution than Ubuntu. Even like Mint and Fedora and stuff are not as user-friendly as Ubuntu is. At least I would argue that. But by doing that, of course, you sacrifice the rights of the user. You sacrifice the modularity that made Unix popular to begin with. So, that's not great as well. But obviously, you have to have user friendliness because people have to want to use your software, right? You can't just build software for the purpose of, well, it's modular. Yeah, but it's not easy to use. Then your software sucks, right? All right. So now that we've discussed the competing interests in open source, how does that work out in like an actual Linux distribution? To understand why a modern Linux distribution isn't optimal, it's not built the way that it really should be, we have to understand what actually goes into making a distribution. So we'll get into that. Ultimately, a Linux distribution really consists of any operating system consists of three categories of programs. At least something like Ubuntu or any most distributions, they have three layers of programs, right? So the layers of programs, let's start from the top down, from the things that you probably most actually interact with your computer with on a daily basis, down to the more abstract stuff. So up top, you have your userland. Your userland programs. These are the actual things you use to manipulate data, to manipulate and deal with data, right? For a modern operating system, this means, probably most importantly, your web browser, your file manager, your word processor, your spreadsheet manager, your slideshow maker, your image viewer, your music program. Let's see, what else? Music program, maybe your settings, right? Also your mail client, which may actually, for most people, it's actually they just use it through their browser, and a text editor. Right, these are probably the most common ones that you use. The next layer of abstraction down is the how you actually go from program to program, if that makes any sense. It's the userland itself, or the environment. So we'll call it the environment. And this consists of, if I'll explain both for graphic interfaces and then just for command line interfaces. This is, in userland apps, I'm actually just going to include two more. I'm going to include your terminal emulator, right, which is big, especially if you're on Linux, but also on Mac too. Your terminal emulator and your app store, applications manager, whatever. In the userland below it, in the actual environment, you've got your shell, very important. You've got your core utils, so the actual commands that you use in your shell, or most of them anyway. You have a package manager, and you have, let's say, lock screen, login prompt, whatever, that kind of thing. Some kind of window manager, and some kind of compositor. Okay, so this is our environment, right? That's our environment, right? And it sits, the environment sits just below this because we can't really use any of these without these. We can't have a terminal without the shell, right? And then finally, we have the actual core of the system. These are things that you probably don't interact with on a daily basis. Maybe you do, I don't know. But that it's the actual operating system itself, what sits between the environment and the hardware. So for this, we've got our libraries, all right? We've got our, which is also our libraries and our compiler. I'll consider them together. We have our bootloader. We have our init system, our initialization system, and of course your kernel. And this is the core, right? So this is what makes up an operating system, more or less. At least in the big stuff, right? There's other stuff, right? You got your BIOS and shit, but we won't even get into that. So I would make the case that on 90%, even more than 90% of Linux installations, every single one of these is a bloated piece of nonsense. Let's go through them to prove my point. All right, so your browser, right? My bet is you're probably using either Chrome or Firefox, right? Firefox is better than Chrome, but Chrome is a monstrosity with system resources. Incredibly bloated. Incredibly bloated. And there are better options, right? You've got things like even like IceWolf, which exists, which is fine. Or was it LibreWolf? It used to be called Iceweasel. Now it's LibreWolf, which is a fork of Firefox, which is better. There's Brave, which is a fork of Chromium, which is better. Even stuff like that is probably too complex for a truly Unixy web browser. There is stuff like Qt Browser, which is good. And of course, there's also Surf, which I'll get into the whole suckless thing in a minute. But there are better options for browsers, right? Your file manager, which might be Conqueror if you're on KDE, or Nautilus, Thunar, right? Something like that. Again, really, really bloated programs. Thunar is actually pretty solid, but very bloated. I would argue that a file manager might not even be something that you actually need, right? At least not a graphical one with the fancy icons. You're probably better off with something like Ranger or NNN or LF from Suckless, but I don't know. Some people do want the icons, but a file manager might be something that you don't even need a terminal, or you don't actually even need a graphical option for. Okay. A word processor. So hopefully you're not actually using Word, but maybe something like LibreDoc or does OpenOffice still exist? I don't know. OpenOffice Doc or something like that. Same goes for your spreadsheet and your slideshow manager, right? Maybe you're using LibreOffice Calc, LibreOffice Show. Not sure. Again, those programs pretty bloated. There are better options for these three here. Again, word processor. I'm not sure you need a graphical word processor. You might just be better off by using, this would be a very Unixy way of doing it. You've got Vim or Emacs or whatever for your text editor, Groff to format it, and then something like Zathura, whatever, to show it, right? To show it through, whether using like text or Markdown, something like that, LaTeX, whatever. Spreadsheet manager. Now you need a spreadsheet manager, right? There are terminal spreadsheet managers like Olio, which are fine, but even something like Gnumeric is pretty good. And then for slideshows, again, you probably do need a visual one because it's a slideshow, but you can use something like was it Pandoc? I'm not sure. There are programs out there that are better than like LibreOffice or especially better than Microsoft Office on this front, right? Terminal. This one's interesting. People don't actually think about the terminal emulator that they're using. Most people just use like the GNOME terminal or console on KDE or some version of Xterm or Alacrity. Xterm is a terrible program, and it's the one which pretty much all modern terminal emulators are built on. It's bad. It's really bad. In fact, if you go into the source code for the X window manager, the Xterm program, they even point out, hey, this sucks. Like, don't use it. We just have to use it because it's like it was only ever meant to be a placeholder, and now we still have Xterm. Like, that version of Xterm still exists despite the fact that the developers themselves said this would just be a placeholder 30 years ago. So if you're using Xterm, don't. Find something better. There are better terminals out there. There's things like ST. But yeah, just really, really bad. Image viewer, right? Most image viewers are now part of the file manager, which no, you don't need to have two programs do two different, or one program do two different things, right? Have a file manager and then have something like the simple X image viewer, Xiv, Skiv, whatever, for your image viewer. Same goes for a video viewer. Use something like MPV or whatever. Music program, there are some good options there. NCMDPMM or whatever is a good one. Settings, you don't need it. Edit config files. There's no reason to have a graphical settings app. Mail client, this is a good one. For some folks, something like, especially if there's a lot of images in what you're doing, you may need a mail client, right? There's some good options. There's always some good options, but a lot of them, again, your mail client should not just be your web browser. Find something simple, find something minimalistic, do it outside your web browser. I promise you it will serve you well in the long run. If you want a terminal mail client, there's stuff like Alpine or NeoMut, among others, that work pretty well. Text editor, right? Get it, Kate, right? There are a lot of visual text editors. You don't need one. Use some kind of terminal-based text editor, right? Nano is great if you're just starting out, but you should probably learn Vim. Vim's great too. But yeah, get rid of your visual text editor. Finally, an app store. Same thing. You don't need it, right? Just learn how to do apt or Pacman or XBPS or Yum, whatever your package manager is. Learn how to use it through the terminal. Do that. And for the love of God, if you're using Snap or Flatpak or App Image or any of these weird containerized application systems, just please stop. They're a security nightmare. They run terribly. They break super easily. They're a massive strain on system resources. Just don't use them. They're just, for the love of God, don't. There are websites dedicated to explaining why these things are bad. Read them. And please get away from using them. They're really, really quite bad. All right, next, and this is the one a lot of people don't think about because they build a system, right, and they want to make things minimalistic. They want to make things clean and Unixy. They clean up all of that stuff, right? They clean up, they're using Surf and LF and, Graph and Vim for their word processing. They're using SXIV. They've got NeoMut set up for their mail client. But the environment itself, the stuff that underlies all of the actual user land, that can also be pretty bloated in ways that a lot of people don't think about, right? So your shell is a big one. Your shell is a lot of what you're using to interact with a computer. And even though it's the default and everybody knows it, Bash, pretty bloated, right? Pretty bloated, a lot of functionality that doesn't really need to be there. There are a lot of better shells out there. ZSH is great. Don't use Fish. For the love of God, don't use Fish, right? But there's ZSH, there's KSH is fine if you're the kind of person that uses the corn shell. You'd be my guess, but you're a little weird, man. There, of course, my shell of choice because I am an enormous elitist is RC, but you can don't use Bash. Get away from that. The Almquist shell is fine too. That's the default I believe that's the default on Mac now, or it used to be, and now it's ZSH. A package manager. Now, this is the unfortunate thing. whatever distribution you're on, you're stuck with whatever package manager you have to deal with. But just know that a lot of the big ones, especially apt and yum, whatever it is for the Red Hat derivatives, they're a little much, right? But they're okay as long as you steer clear from the containerized systems, as long as you steer clear from AppImage and Flatpak and Snap and all that shit. You'll be okay. But you should learn how to use whatever the backend is. So DPKG if you're on a Debian system, and also you should learn how to make packages yourself by like cloning them from Git and then install your packages. That's also a good thing you should learn how to do. The window manager itself, that's big, right? GNOME, KDE, a lot of these window managers are enormous programs. Even the tiling window managers like i3 or Xmonad, still a little bloated, right? There are some good options. Even if you want a stacking window manager, you can always use like TWM or DTWM. As far as tiling window manager, you should use DWM, the suckless one. Very good, very simple. We'll talk about the suckless programs in a minute because that might be too much for a lot of people. But even if you're using something that isn't perfect, right? Make that move in the right direction, right? If you're using GNOME, go to XFCE. If you're using XFCE, go to like i3. Only if you're using i3 or Xmonad, then go to DWM, right? Finally, a lock screen, right? Just use SLock, something like that. Or don't have a lock screen, right? You don't really need one. I would just say, and this is the way I have it set up on all of my systems, when I turn on my computer, it goes to command line. And only then, if I really, really need it to, do I type start X, and then I go into a GUI, right? That's probably the better way to do it because you're separating yourself from the windowing environment. That way, you're training yourself to work off of the terminal. A compositor. So whatever your window manager is, it will be based on some kind of compositor, which will invariably be either X11 or Wayland. The question of which is better, X11 or Wayland, is tough because X11 has a lot of programs that are built in that are kind of bad, right? Like Xterm, right? But the underlying software is pretty decent. Wayland will probably be at some point a better system, and there will come a day, I think, when a lot of the window managers switch to Wayland over X11. I think Unity is on Wayland now. So that day is coming, but for the time being, X is fine. It's an old program. It's not terribly bloated. Just get away from like Xterm. That's what I would say. Finally, in the environment area, there's one thing that a lot of people don't think about, which is their core utils. No one ever thinks about the core utils, right? By and large, most Linux distributions are running GNU core utils, which is, I think that's the name of the package, right? And this is my problem with GNU and the FSF more broadly, is that they wanted to build a Unix-based system as quickly as they could, right? So they built the core utils first, and then they built everything else. So like GNOME, back when GNOME was actually a GNU project, and Herd and all these other programs that GNU is GNUmeric, right? All this stuff that GNU is famous for now, that was all an afterthought to building the core utils, right? Because they figured, hey, that's pretty easy, right? We can knock that out in a year or two. The problem is the core utils, because of the sort of slapdash way they were thrown together, they're really outdated. They're really clunky, right? There are some better options out there, right? There's the BusyBox ones, which the Swiss Army knife of embedded Linux, they call it, right? BusyBox is great. Personally, I use the 9front, Plan 9 from UserSpace utils. Those are much better, right? I'm very fond of all of the Plan 9 stuff just because it was the last version of true Unix. So, there's that. But that's the environment, right? Then we get down to the core of the system itself. and most people never ever bother with this either. But if you really want to debloat a system from top down, you have to consider the core of the operating system, right? There's four components to the core. You have your libraries, your init system, your bootloader, and your kernel. Those are the main four. Libraries is a big one, right? Pretty much every Linux distribution is built off of glibc, which is the GNU implementation of C, which they needed to do to build the core utils and then to build everything else. GNU's implementation of C, of ANSI C, is also pretty bad. Again, it's slapdash, it's clunky, and it's dynamically linked. So the binaries are all enormous, right? And you can test this. Those of you who know any amount of C. Write the Hello World program in C and compile it. It's like 700 kilobytes. It's an enormous program, and it's because of the dynamic linking of the libraries. It's because the libraries are so bloated. Even stdio.h is a huge program by modern standards. Again, there are better alternatives here, right? You don't have to use glibc if you don't want to. You can use something like Muscle, which takes it from 700 kilobytes down to 7, right? There are much better implementations of the C programming language and of other programming languages than oftentimes the reference implementations like glibc. As far as an initialization system goes, this is actually a bigger controversy than I ever would have expected. Of course, for a long time, Linux distributions ran off of sys5 init, right, which was carried over from the old. It was basically just a GNU implementation of the old Unix initialization systems. And even that was pretty bloated. That was not great. And there was talk about replacing it. But the newer version of sys5 init, which 90% of Linux distributions run on, even supposedly minimal systems like Debian or Arch, they all run on the great evil, right? The great Satan, the Babylon of Linux, System D, which also very bloated, ridiculous program, spawns everything in as daemons. It's a ridiculous program, and everybody noticed how much slower all of their systems got after Systemd was adopted in whatever operating system they use, right? Everybody noticed this. There are very few people out there who actually like Systemd among the user space, right? The developers all like Systemd because they're part of that third competing interest in the open source movement, which is the user friendliness. Systemd is more user friendly. It's more developer friendly. It's easier to build applications to work off of Systemd daemons than it is off of the old sys5 init daemons. But that is a problem, and sys5 init is, or Systemd, it's got to go, right? The alternative, right? That's the question. What's the alternative? There are better versions, right? There's Runit, there's OpenRC, which again is from Plan 9. There is SInit, which was from Suckless, I think, or somehow connected to Suckless. So there are better options. Personally, I like Runit the most, but I'm open to conversations on that one. The bootloader, the other part of it, an operating system, right? Most people are using Grub. Grub actually isn't that bloated. It's pretty clean. There are some other bootloaders out there, but honestly, messing with a bootloader that's something for the real deep OS nerds to get into. So you could probably just leave that alone. And of course, the final component of an operating system, which of course lends its name to the entire system, is the kernel. And this opens up a much bigger question. Is the Linux kernel bloated? That's certainly the question for the ages. Some people, like Andrew Tannenbaum back in the day, would have argued that Linux was inherently bloated because it was based on a monolithic kernel system. It's much better to have a microkernel and then a series of Unix servers that ran on top of it, or some kind of hybrid kernel where some of the Unix servers are part of the kernel and some of them are not. I mean, there is a case to be made, right? Linux is an enormous, enormous operating system now. Even the kernel is, what, 15, 20 million lines of code? Which I understand is for hardware interoperability, but that does make the system a little bit fucked. You know what I'm saying? Maybe BSD is better, right? I've always been of the opinion. Um, I've mentioned it multiple times in the course of this rant, but I'm very, very fond of the Plan 9 utilities. Of everything Plan 9 did was great. And also the sort of modern day inheritors of some of the Plan 9 ideology, if you want to call it that, even if it's not directly following in the same footsteps, are the people over at suckless.org. If you're ever looking for a minimalistic, highly configurable program, check and see if Suckless has a version of it, right? I'll give you an example. GNOME, the desktop environment GNOME has, actually, let me look up exactly how many it is. How many lines of code are in GNOME? About 40 million. About 40 million lines of code in GNOME. Right? Now, DWM, which is the suckless implementation of a windowing environment, a tiling windowing environment, is 2,000. That's it. It's 2,000 lines of C code. So it's really, really simple and lightning fast. So here's the problem, though, with the suckless tools if you want to use them. If you can figure out how to use them, great, do it. The problem is there are no config files. Everything is statically linked, so there are no config files. It's only source code. So if you want to edit, say, if you want to edit DWM, you want to change what the key bindings are, there's no i3 config to edit that for. You want to change... you want to have mod shift I open up a web browser. You have to download the DWM source code, edit that key binding in the source code in C, and recompile it. Do you want to do that? And again, this is where even those three interests in the open source community also apply to you, depending on what you want to do. For me to do that, it's fine, whatever. But you may not want to, right? Surf is another example. Surf is their web browser, the Suckless web browser. Really, really simple. Again, only a couple of thousand lines of code, but it has almost none of the features of a modern web browser that you've come to expect, right? It has no tabs. So the way that you're supposed to use it if you want to have tabs is to open up different instances of Surf and then stack them in a tiling window manager. Has no bookmarks. You want to have bookmarks, you can create a text file and link with URLs in it and link it into Surf and stuff like that. Which again, you can do, right? And you can do it really, really cleanly and really, really bloatlessly, but the cost is your time a little bit, right? But a lot of the Suckless programs, Surf is probably the one that's the most like, come on, just download a web browser. But there are things such as ST, which is their terminal, which is great. SLOC or Slack, which is their login screen, which is also great. And you're probably not going to edit that stuff altogether that much. So when you're going to edit, when you download the terminal source code, you're just going to change the font size and whatever. Everything else is going to be set by your init by your bash RC or your ZSHRC or your whatever your dot files are for your preferred shell. You're not going to be messing around with the terminal much. Same goes for a file manager. Theirs is LF, which is great, or dmenu, which is their menu bar for their window manager. You're not really going to be messing around with those too much like you would with a web browser, so you can go ahead and use those, and those are great. There, another good resource for those of you who want to debloat your system is the website harmful.cat-v.org. This is where the classic joke about the head command, which for those of you who don't know, it prints the top 11 lines of a text file. They'll say the head command is pointless and should be removed from Unix. If you want to see the top 11 lines of a file, you should just use sed11q, which does the same exact thing. And they kind of have a point. It's head and also tail are sort of redundant files or redundant Unix commands. But there's a lot of good stuff that you can do, and I would encourage anyone, for the sake of getting the most out of your hardware, really take a good look at what you're actually running, right? Walk through, your programs and try to make them as minimalistic as possible. I promise you, you will notice a difference, not just in your computer's efficiency and your ability to efficiently use system resources, but also in your efficiency in working and doing whatever you have to do at a computer. You will be a more effective user if you focus on that Unix mentality, the suckless mentality, whatever. But in conclusion, use BSD.